Hi everybody, welcome to this timeline documentary. My name is Dan Snow and here I am in a Lancaster bomber cockpit, one of the few remaining Lancasters from the Second World War, to tell you about my new history channel. It's called History Hit. It's like Netflix for history. Hundreds of history documentaries on there and interviews with many of the world's best historians. Follow the information below this film or just search online for History Hit and make sure you use the code TIMELINE to get a special introductory offer. Now enjoy this show.
In the lead-up to one of the most important years in the Australian War Memorial's history, I'll go behind the scenes to learn how the Great War shaped a young nation and reveal the powerful stories behind the names on the Roll of Honour. In this episode,
the story goes that they fired at least 100 million rounds during the war, which mathematically works out to be something like 40 rounds every minute of the entire war from beginning to end.
The horrifying dawn of industrial warfare.
Imagine that grinding towards you, or imagine a shell from that weapon landing in your midst.
There's nowhere on earth more densely sown with Australian sacrifice. And letters from the front line.
In time, he would become the spokesman for many other voices that were silenced.
How one young soldier's words defined the Great War.
It's horrible, but why should you people at home not know?
100 years on, Australia remembers. A year in the life of the Australian War Memorial. The soul of a nation. The War Memorial is one of Australia's most popular landmarks, and with almost 1 million visitors each year, there is an endless stream of guided tours.
Welcome to Canberra to the War Memorial. I'm Peter, one of the volunteer guides.
The volunteer tour guides are the heartbeat of the memorial, and they're a small but powerful presence.
And then we've got a whole series of memorials between where we're standing and right up the top.
Now, folks, we are going into the Second World War, if you'd like to follow me. There is a painting of Teddy, and I'll tell you more about why Teddy is so special. I'm a voluntary guide. I'm one of about 120, I think it is. And each one of us does his or her own tour. So even if you did a tour in the morning and a tour in the afternoon, you wouldn't be doing the same things. And I think that's part of the beauty of it, the fact that we all have our own tours.
It was done by a one-armed artist, strangely enough. He lost his right arm at the Battle of Bull Court in 1917.
So these men were asleep below deck, not knowing that there was any danger in Sydney Harbour that night, and they never woke up. Come and I'll tell you a little story to cheer you up.
The exhibition galleries may be the public face of the memorial, but to gain a real insight into just how vast the memorial's artefacts collection really is, we need to go off-site. The Trello Technology Centre is the memorial's storage and conservation facility. It's also the home of the large technical objects, a collection of war artefacts that are simply too vast to be exhibited in the museum's galleries. Amid all the aircraft, rockets, vehicles, tanks, artillery and equipment, I'm searching for the weapons that are directly linked to the Great War, and in particular, to the Western Front.
When the Anzacs arrived on the Western Front, they faced the realities of full-scale,
industrialised warfare, far removed from the primitive hand-to-hand combat of Gallipoli. What they encountered were the first weapons of mass destruction. The Battle of the Western Front was where new death machines dominated. Howitzers, trench mortars, machine guns, flamethrowers, and poisonous gas.
It's the sort of first step change in the industrialisation of war. It introduced massive artillery, not only the calibre of the guns, the numbers of guns, the lethality of all the ammunition that was fired, machine guns, of course, barbed wire, tanks were introduced, aircraft and airships, all of this industrialisation of war, and operating these were the tiny, insignificant men, the frail bodies of men who were industrialising the way of producing mass casualties. And it's sad, it characterises warfare today. So I suspect looking at those instruments of war as they're displayed now on a concrete slab in a warehouse, you'd say, imagine that grinding towards you, or imagine a shell from that weapon landing in your midst.
By the time the Australian soldiers arrived on the Western Front in 1916, the war was at a stalemate. The Allies and the Germans were deadlocked in the vast network of trenches splitting Europe. A 750-kilometre long front line snaked its way south from Flanders and Belgium, through France to the Swiss border. Consequently, both sides of the battle turned to new technology to break the impasse, thus forever changing the nature of warfare.
Mr. Abbott, when did you come to the conclusion that Australia and Australians should remember the victories of the Western Front at least as much, if not more, than Gallipoli?
For us, World War I was so much more than Gallipoli. Gallipoli was the beginning, but it certainly wasn't the end. We lost 8,000 or so at Gallipoli, but we lost 46,000 in France. Almost 300,000 Australians were involved on the Western Front. And as I say, the 5 divisions of the Australian Army were, in many respects, the finest troops of the British Empire. Gallipoli, for all its heroism, was a defeat, Neil. The Western Front, for all of its carnage, was a victory. And we should remember our victories no less than our defeats.
To truly comprehend the grand-scale carnage of the Western Front, you have to understand the weapons that dominated the battlefield.
This is perhaps the most famous British gun of the First World War, the 18-pounder. So, more of these used than any other gun, and they fired more shells than any other gun.
So that's an 18-pound shell?
An 18-pound shell,
it's what it's
right.
firing, it's
Yep.
18 pounds?
Yep, that's right.
And how prolific were these?
Well, they built about 8,000 of them from memory, but the story goes that they fired at least 100 million rounds during the war, which mathematically works out to be something like 40 rounds every minute of the entire war from beginning to end.
Wow. And then for every shell that's going in that direction, there's 100 million
Exactly.
German shells coming the
There's
other
at
way.
least one coming back. You've got to bet on that.
I suppose what you've always got to try and remember is there was a team of men that lived and died alongside
Absolutely, yeah.
an object like this.
Crew of about 10, so quite a large crew for a relatively small gun. But of course, a lot of them are busy keeping you supplied with shells so that you can keep firing at the enemy. Perhaps contrary to many people's expectation, this isn't really a war about men charging each other with bayonets. It's a war where men are killed by machine guns and overwhelmingly by artillery like this. It's the German 77 and the British 18-pounder that probably do the lion's share of the killing on both sides during the war.
Senior curator Nick Fletcher and his team are selecting weapons to go on exhibition in the Memorial's new First World War gallery. One of them will be the lethal German Maxim machine gun.
This was such a quantum
Yes,
leap forward
more
with the
efficient
technology.
and
You know, the 666 rounds a minute, 11 rounds a second.
yeah, and
With no precedent. There was nothing before Hiram Maxim came up with it.
yeah, exactly. He
just-
revolutionised the world for
He
this.
just pulled it from a clear blue sky and made this thing. Evil creation.
Yes, the devil's paintbrush.
The fact that its application is dreadful, but when you see the guts of it and the inside of it and the ingenuity,
Yeah, and the precision with which it's all
it's a
made.
miracle of engineering. You know, you cannot help but admire
we're at that real turning point in history. We're past the Victorian era, and suddenly this is engineering which the modern engineer looks at and approves of. The war on the Western Front for the Australians who have come from Gallipoli is a new world. Yes, they've had machine guns at Gallipoli for sure, but not in the numbers, not with the kind of science applied to their use that we're getting.
And it's when it makes its noise, you think that would have been the last noise that thousands upon thousands of people heard. In order to comprehend the brutality of these museum relics, you have to see them through the eyes of a soldier, like young Australian Alec Ross. He wrote, "One feels on a battlefield such as this, one can never survive, or that if the body lives, the brain must go forever. For the horrors one sees and the never-ending shock of the shells is more than can be borne. Hell must be a home to it." Alec Ross was a gentle young soldier and a former journalist with the Melbourne Argus newspaper. When he arrived on the Western Front, Alec Ross soon realised that human beings are never more inventive than when it comes to ways of killing each other. He faced modern monsters like the 9.2-inch howitzer. It required a working crew of 14 men and propelled shells into enemy positions almost 10 kilometres away. The First World War marked the arrival of a brand new weapon by the British to help break the deadlock of trench warfare, the armoured tank. They were designed to survive artillery bombardments, machine gun fire, and crush through barbed wire in an attempt to break the stalemate. The deadly German Minenwerfers were efficient killing machines, capable of dropping shells and carrying massive explosive loads into the trenches. Alec Ross wanted those back home in Australia to understand this gruesome reality of the battlefields. Copies of the typed transcripts of Alec's letters were donated to the memorial in 1927 by his grief-stricken father. The originals were either lost or destroyed. Despite their graphic content, miraculously, the letters were not detected by the wartime censors before they were received by Alec's family back home in Australia. I am quite excited. Tomorrow I shall be in the midst of it all. John Alexander Ross, who cannot tread upon a worm, who has never struck another human being except in fun, who cannot read of the bravery of others at the front without tears welling to his eyes, who cannot think of blood and mangled bodies without bodily sickness. This man, I, go forth tomorrow to kill and maim, murder and ravage. It is funny, but in time, he would become the spokesman for many other voices that were silenced.
Shrapnel, Minewerfers, whiz-bangs, bombs, lacrimose shells, gas shells, and thousands of gaping dead. The stench and the horridness of it can but be mentioned. I have sat on corpses, walked on corpses, and pillaged corpses.
The journey to discover more about Alec Ross and his letters would eventually take me to the trenches of the Western Front. I've been given special access to the War Memorial's storage facility, where the enormity of the collection not on permanent display is almost too much to take in. But the truth is, these objects are just so much brass and steel unless they're used as keys to open doors into the ugly horror of the Great War and into the lives of absent people. Of the 60,000 Australians who perished in the Great War, over 46,000 were killed on the Western Front, cut down by weapons like these. I've been following the story of Alec Ross, an Australian soldier who wrote extraordinary letters about his wartime experiences. Alec's destiny is entwined with that of his younger brother, a Queensland plantation farmer named Goldie. In 1915, Goldie was the first of the two brothers to sign up for the Great War. Miraculously, he survived Gallipoli and was then transported to fight on the Western Front. It was 1 year later that Alec joined the AIF, and when he arrived in France, he hoped to be reunited with Goldie so that the two brothers could fight and protect each other on the battlefield. The memorial's historian, Aaron Pegram, has studied the fates of Alec and Goldie.
I've been researching the Rawes brothers' story, not necessarily from the legacy that they have here at the memorial, but mainly from a military perspective. I've been able to look through the battalion war diaries from the period covering the fighting at Posiers. I've also been able to plot down some of the attacks that the Rawes brothers took part in on original trench maps from the period. So that'll actually inform us when Neil and I are on the battlefields about where all this took place, where it all unfolded, and actually make a lot more sense from Alec Rawes' poignant letters.
This is the Australian Memorial, just outside the village of Posiers on the Western Front. And it was here that tens of thousands of Australian soldiers experienced their part of the Somme offensive in the summer of 1916, the midpoint of the war. Australian achievements around here came at the cost of 23,000 casualties. Nearly 7,000 of them were suffered around this point, once occupied by a windmill. It was those events and this place that inspired Australia's war historian Charles Bean to say that there was nowhere on earth more densely sown with Australian sacrifice. I've come here to try and understand what happened to Alec Rawes and to his brother Goldie. Historian Aaron Pegram has joined me in Posiers to show me the battlefields where Alec wrote his graphic letters home. So what was the significance of Posiers as a location?
In terms of a location, Posiers sits on a very slight ridge, and that was deemed the tactically favourable ground for the German troops who came through here in 1914.
It was in a landscape just like this that Alec Rawes came to understand exactly what the Somme was all about in July 1916. Here, the trenches are still visible, as well as innumerable craters from the shells that drop night and day and night. Alec had come up here expecting to be reunited with his brother Goldie, and instead he was here alone in hell.
We are now actually standing in trenches from the fighting in July 1916. And it's exactly in trenches like this that Alec Rawes fought in at Posiers.
Can you describe for me what that frontline experience was actually all about for men like Alec?
These trenches probably would have been about 6 to 8 feet deep. If you can imagine thousands of men living in close confines in trenches much like this. These are only very roughly built constructions that men would have still had to persevere with rats, with lice, with mud, the rain. It would have been a terrible existence. And if you were in a forward trench at Posiers, men would have been expected to man that position, rain, hail or shine.
The historically significant letters that Alec Rawes wrote from the Western Front graphically describe the horrendous conditions the soldiers encountered.
The place was not littered, but covered with dead. And as we were under continuous fire and were moving about a lot, and when still or in very narrow, shallow trenches, we could do no burying. The last meal I had was one I shook from a dead German.
What I'm always mindful of is the smell of these places. Apart from anything else, you've got thousands of men who are a long way from proper sanitation. But then there's the dead. These places must have been foul beyond belief.
The stench would have been unbearable. Not only are men living in this troglodyte existence in the earth, There are rotting corpses out in no man's land, exposed to the sun, exposed to the elements, being ripped apart by artillery fire. You've also got the buzz of humanity. You've got men living in close confines to each other. You have the stench of cordite from all this shell fire and explosions.
And when you mix into that thousands of Germans trying to kill you,
Yeah.
what else is in that mix?
As soon as a man sticks his head up over these trenches, he is then going to be drawing fire from machine guns, from rifles. His position is going to be shelled, and he runs the risk of inhaling poisonous gas.
The stalemate of World War I left men caught in trenches for months, leaving both sides to resort to gas and chemical warfare. The memorial's collection includes artefacts that represent the desperate measures that were used to combat this new weapon of war.
Once people realised that you could stop an army, basically, you could put thousands of men out of action, gas became, you know, one of the tools of the trade.
Who was the first into action with poison gas in World War I?
It's believed the French used a tear gas early in the war, but most books that you read, it's the Germans on the 22nd of April in 1915.
What was it that they used?
Chlorine, which is a heavy gas. They could see it coming, a green cloud, and it would roll across the battlefield. It drops down into your trenches and goes down into your dugouts. And because it's heavy, you can't get rid of it. They have to actually sweep it out with, like, brooms. I mean, they have two forms of gas in the First World War. There's a vesicant, which is a gas like mustard gas. It would stick to your skin, it would vaporise, it would lay around, and if you touched it, it would be absorbed through the pores of your skin, or you swallowed it and it would burn your lungs out. Then you had irritant gases, which chlorine was one of them. If you got enough chlorine in your body, you would basically drown.
And what were the first responses? Because I don't suppose that anyone had any idea what to do with it.
Once the British had got gas, they went, what the hell is this? What's happening? How do we actually counteract this? So they put the orders out to urinate on your handkerchief. If you need be, put it over your mouth and your nose.
What's in urine that protects you from
like
gas?
alkaline solution. They would or put these alkaline solutions in buckets or water in buckets, anything with liquid, until they captured some Germans, and the Germans were carrying a pad respirator. This one basically had a chemical impregnated in it, and it was hydroscopic, so it kept moist. Then they went, there's a possibility we're going to get other forms of gas. So they went to the P hood, and then they went to the PH hood. This was also called a tube helmet, because it has a tube, basically, which is an exhalation valve, and inside is a metal tube which you gripped in your teeth and you breathe through. By the start of 1916, troops were starting to get issued these. This is a small box respirator.
This is completely different technology from just breathing through
totally
some sort of fabric with some or other chemical on it.
Totally.
Why didn't everyone use it much, much more?
After the First World War into the Second World War, everybody was equipped for gas, everybody had it, no one wanted to use it.
Just seems amazing that in amongst all the horror of the First World War, there was some element of it that was found to be too horrible.
Yeah, and this is it.
I'll blow you up, I'll cut you up, I'll smash you to bits.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't send over poison gas because that's just not nice.
That's just not nice.
The handful of letters that Alec sent home to his family and friends reveal a man who's struggling, a man cut to the bone by all the horror, the carnage that he's seen, and the suffering that he's experienced himself. And one letter that he sent to his brother-in-law, Norman, is particularly harrowing. It was awful, but we had to drive the men by every possible means. The wounded and killed had to be thrown to one side. I refused to let any sound man help a wounded man. The sound men had to dig. I took it on myself to insist on the men staying, saying that any man who stopped digging would be shot. We dug on and finished amid a tornado of bursting shells.
I was buried twice and thrown down several times, buried with dead and dying. The ground was covered with bodies in all stages of decay and mutilation, and I would, after struggling free from the earth, pick up a body by me to try and lift him out with me, and find him a decayed corpse. I pulled a head off, was covered with blood. The horror was indescribable.
I've had much luck and kept my nerves so far. The awful difficulty is to keep it. The bravest of all often lose it. Only the men you have trusted and believed in proved to be equal to it. One or two of my friends stood splendidly, like granite rocks round which the sea raged in vain.
They were all junior officers, but many other fine men broke to pieces. Everyone called it shell shock, but what 90% get is justifiable funk due to the collapse of the helm of self-control.
The shell shock Alec writes of is dramatically illustrated in the memorial's photographic archives. Among the most poignant are the original negative glass plates of the Great War portraits that were taken on the Western Front in the French village of Vignacourt. Thousands of photos were taken of Australian soldiers during their brief break from the horrors of the battlefield. Curator David Gist has studied the portraits for signs of shell shock.
Are these men who've seen and experienced something awful?
There's a very famous quote from a man named Edgar Rule with the 14th Battalion, and he passed the men from 1st Division when they were relieved at Posiers, and his description of these men after they've just endured what up until that point was the heaviest artillery bombardment that Australian soldiers had ever endured. He describes men with glassy eyes, starey, very doleful looking expression. The kind of expression which in later conflicts came to be referred to as the 1,000-yard stare. And we believe that this is what we're seeing in many of these images.
Try to imagine you are in such lethal danger. Every sense in your body is focused on doing your job, not letting your mates down, but please God, may I survive. That's washing through you. I can imagine how they felt, but these deeply experienced soldiers must have felt enormous fear. They would know, as sure as night follows day, that so many of their mates had been killed. It must be my turn soon.
When you look at these pictures one by one, what symptoms of, say, shell shock or some or other psychological trauma do you see? This guy here jumps out for me. The slumped position, his hands, everything about his body language just says someone who's barely in the room. He's a long way away from that seat.
Here's a man who just looks like he has been ground down. He's had enough and he's got nothing left. What is important to remember, Neil, if you're an Australian soldier on the Somme in the First World War, by definition, you have been through hell. I mean, to me, you look at a face like that, and that tells you pretty much everything you need to know about war without having to read a single book.
You know what I get as well, just from looking at them generally? You know, it's like the gentleman of a jury almost. There's something accusatory. You know, it's like they look out at the modern world and, you know, there's an accusation about why has this happened to me? There's a really strong question somehow. It's like they're accusing the present, our present, of what happened to them in the past.
Our job here at the memorial is partly to bear witness and partly to make sure that what these guys endured wasn't for nothing.
I won't give you my idea of war, but if I ever come back, I'll tell you. Be content to know that it is bloody awful. I've stuck it all right so far, not lost my nerve, not gone mad, and not fallen down on my job. And I've had some pretty rotten ones.
It was in these open fields close to Posiers that the lives of both Alec Ross and his brother Goldie were finally cut short.
How did you go about pinpointing where Goldie died in amongst this melee of thousands of men?
Although we don't have an eyewitness testimony as to what happened to Goldie, we're able to consult the historical records and know where the 23rd Battalion was located before the attack and what their objectives were during this particular assault. And we look quite literally, we are walking in the footsteps of the 23rd Battalion. They were advancing in a line up this road, through the cornfield, up to capture the slight ridge line here in the fields in front of us.
While Goldie was engaged in that advance, where is Alec Ross at that moment?
Alec Ross is not on the battlefield just yet. He's serving with the 22nd Battalion. He has just arrived in France and he is just making his way to the fighting here on the Somme. Alec Ross is seeking a transfer to the 23rd Battalion so that he can fight alongside his brother. But of course, Goldie Ross has already got into battle and disappeared, and he's never seen again. It's only after Alec Ross joins the 23rd Battalion several days later that he learns of his brother's death.
How close did Alec come to being reunited with his brother?
It can honestly be said that they missed each other within days.
Before going into this next affair, at the same dreadful spot, I want to tell you, so that it may be on record, that I honestly believe Goldie and many other officers were murdered on that night through the incompetence, callousness and personal vanity of those high in authority. I realise the seriousness of what I say, but I am so bitter and the facts are so palpable that it must be said. Please be very discreet with this letter, unless I should go under.
And so what then became of Alec?
We don't know precisely what happened to Alec other than the fact that he just disappeared on the 24th of August 1916. We don't know what happened to him, but we just know that he was killed. And that, based on the evidence from the war diaries, we just know that his unit was literally just over there.
In the vicinity of that lone tree there?
That's correct. There's a cruel sense of irony that two brothers who had tried so hard to be reunited in the battle, to be fighting together, are sort of reunited in death.
I've come to the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux to pay my final respects to Alec and Goldie Ross. When Alec arrived on the Western Front, his aim was to find his beloved younger brother, but a reunion was never to be. The utter futility of war that Alec raged against in his letters is all the more agonising when you see his name carved in stone, along with the other 11,000 missing Australian soldiers whose bodies were never recovered from the battlefields of France and Belgium. The Roll of Honour is in many ways the focal point of the Australian War Memorial. Every year, thousands upon thousands of people come from all over the country, all over the world, to look for the names of loved ones, ancestors, on these huge bronze plaques. And tragically, this is a piece of work that will never be finished, because there will always be more names to add, more losses to count. And in order to make sure that every name here is eligible, each case is carefully investigated and considered to make sure that every name here truly belongs. That is the job of a small but dedicated team of men and women who go through it all and check and check and check again. They are the guardians of the record.
Well, we're in the stacks of the Bean building here at the War Memorial, and this row, this is my work here. These boxes that you can see are the Roll of Honour cards. There's about 102 of these boxes, filled with 1,000 names each. And these cards were put together by the Australian War Records Office. Without these cards, you did not get onto the Roll of Honour.
Assistant Curator Meredith Duncan's work involves scrutinising every new name proposed for the Roll of Honour. She's been investigating a name missing from the World War I panels.
So on to the routine agenda items. First World War, case for inclusion on the Roll of Honour. This is Lance Corporal George Edward Glover of the 59th Battalion. Now, Meredith, you might like to just expand on what the circumstances of that case were.
Yeah, the story with this one was quite unusual because we were contacted by the family who assumed that he would be on the Roll of Honour, and they came to look and he wasn't there. We investigated, and it was when we looked at the service record that it became apparent how the mistake had happened. So Lance Corporal George Edward Glover's card caused us a lot of problems because this card went missing when the roll was being developed. George's card went with his service record to the National Archives, and because of that, his name did not go on the roll.
After her discovery that George Glover's card was misplaced for nearly 100 years, Meredith is now going to contact one of George's descendants.
We'll be meeting Laurie soon, and I've corresponded with Laurie for more than a year now about his great uncle George Glover. And when the recommendation came through and he'd been approved, I think the email to Laurie went, woohoo, you know, we've done it, and he's going on.
From a roll of honour perspective, he appears to meet all the eligibility criteria, so we'd be recommending at the August council meeting that he be added to the roll of honour.
Every story needs that final little, you know, punch line.
While Meredith waits to meet George's relative, in another building at the memorial, the phone lines are running hot for the busy donations and collections team.
Hi, okay, so you have something you'd like to donate to the memorial? Okay, can you tell me a bit about your collection, please?
Over the last 12 months, 26,874 items were donated to the War Memorial by the public. These include 8,071 diaries and letters, 151 artworks, 2,377 items of heraldry and technology, 13,097 photos, film and sound recordings.
So what have we got today?
Collection relating to the Boer War.
Okay.
Emma Jones and Cameron Ross are dedicated members of the memorial's collections team.
There are times when we'll open something up and go, wow, this is something very important, something very unusual.
But it's now photographs.
Look at that. How much of a backstory did we get on this one?
Unfortunately, not a lot anymore. The most backstory we have is from his diaries.
Okay, so we'll have to put it together ourselves.
Indeed.
Okay. A lot of my job is making sure that when donation comes in, that we document it really well, that we write everything down and get, quite often we refer to it as the backstory. What is the story behind the collection?
It's a very large pile of letters. Now, this whole collection relates to a lady who had 5 brothers, all who served.
I have had times where I have been reading through a private record collection, literally crying, to see what these people wrote, letters of goodbye especially. It is the greatest of inspiration to me to know how gallantly he fell. Oh, no, look, she's obviously cried on the letter. Oh, you can see here where the tears actually smudged the word.
It's very sad.
Oh.
Occasionally, potentially dangerous items are received.
People can literally walk in through the door and say, here's all my stuff. You can see here we've had people walk in literally with a suitcase full of material. We get a lot of weapons coming in as a donation, and of course a weapon is designed to be dangerous. So therefore we have very strict handling procedures around it. I can already see we've got a hazard in there.
Asbestos, everyone's favourite.
There's a lot of asbestos in war-related things because it's non-flammable. I'll leave that one bagged up, I think. And occasionally something a little more serious, such as radioactivity. A lot of glow-in-the-dark material originally was glow-in-the-dark because it had radioactive elements in it. And so when a collection comes in, we will run a Geiger counter over it to get a reading.
So it was 0.5 millisieverts, which makes it radioactive, but not dangerously radioactive.
So you've just come back from Afghanistan. Okay. There's always a chance that the next phone call is going to have just an amazing collection or amazing story that's going to come in. That's one of the great things about working here. You just never know what's going to come in next.
So come on in. Okay. This is where we keep all our new donations. We've got one that's of particular interest to everyone at the War Memorial.
Okay. When did it arrive in the
collection? Came about a month ago. Now this one is a naval uniform. As you can see, It's a very small set of pants. It was made by a nurse who served in the First World War. She met a sailor in the British Merchant Navy.
Oh, gosh, right.
During the Gallipoli campaign. And they got married.
She made this for her children, their children?
She's made this for her children. We've got a photograph of the children wearing them. So there's a nurse outfit as well.
Oh, no.
So that's actually their daughter in the sailor's outfit and their son in the nurse's outfit.
Oh, right, OK.
The daughter's 5 years old and the son's 7 years old.
Right, so the son's in the nurse's outfit?
Yes.
There's a story there about.
I'm sure.
That is brilliant. I think it's fair to imagine that they were an eccentric couple.
I'd say so, yes.
If this is how they were treating their children.
After extensive research, Assistant Curator Meredith Duncan has discovered why World War I soldier George Glover's name is missing from the Roll of Honour. Now, Meredith is meeting with George's descendant, Laurie Jury, to inform him the case has been solved.
After many emails.
I know, it's ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah,
Well, we're going to go up and I want to have a little chat where you would have gone up and sort of been looking for George, George's name.
Yes.
So the thing about it, Laurie, is that with George, we didn't do the same level of research at the time when we found out about him, because all we were doing was finding out why he wasn't on the roll. So it wasn't until a bit later that I wanted to find out, well, what was George's actual story? These are the actual original bits of paper from the Red Cross Wounded and Missing inquiry. He was admitted on the 14th with shell wounds, so he didn't die straight away. And he had shell wounds in the abdomen, hip, hand, face and mouth. And he died on the 16th. And the witness says, I don't suppose he ever regained consciousness. And he was buried at Dernancourt, which is where you went to.
Yeah, when you hear about the wounds and that he was he died 2 days after he was wounded, which is different to what I thought. I thought he was shelled, taken to the aid station and was pronounced dead there. So this is new stuff to me. On that note, I have some things for you to see. You haven't seen these, have you?
Oh, no. Oh.
That's George. That's our man.
Look, he's just a kid. My goodness.
That was before he left.
It's really like having everyone's family history as my job. You get to know their stories, you get to know their families. And by the end of it, of course, you feel like you know that name behind the bronze on the panel. The 59th Battalion, sadly, takes up about 3.5 panels on the Roll of Honour. It's actually a long, sad walk along here.
Oh,
I think if you look at the names in too much detail, it starts to get to you a bit. Panel 167, I believe. 59th Battalion starts here. And this, he should have been under Gill, Glacian, Glenn,
and then Glover.
And then Glover. That's where he should go.
Should be. Yeah.
Glover.
Yeah.
And he would have known all these fellows. Well, some of them.
Some of them, yes.
They would have been through thick and thin together. Yeah. Very sad. And sad that he wasn't there for 100 years.
Yeah.
But we're going to find a spot for George.
That's good. That's good.
Eventually, they're going to recast what we call the supplementary panel.
The supplementary panel.
So if we go to the supplementary panel, we haven't got anyone else from the 59th.
No.
So George will be there on from the 59th.
It means a lot to me, and I know it means a lot to the family to have his name up here. I'm very proud that I've been able to be involved in.
Well, you did it. Better late than never, you think?
It's always better late than never. Yeah, so...
Yeah, I agree.
I appreciate it very much, Meredith, what you've been doing.
No, it's been a pleasure. I think in my job interview they asked, you know, how do you see your role fitting into the bigger vision of the War Memorial? And I did actually say, well, it's the centre of it, isn't it? And I still feel that it is. I think the Roll of Honour is the centre of what we do here, and the rest of what is displayed, the exhibitions, the galleries, the objects, they hang on the stories of the people that have died and not made it home, and it's for them. We guard the record, they say.
The Roll of Honour will always be the heartbeat of the memorial. Soon, I would meet with a descendant of Alec Ross, the young soldier who wrote powerful letters home from the Western Front. Once again, the Roll of Honour would prove to be the place where the past and the present. My journey to discover more about Great War soldier Alec Ross and his brother Goldie began in the archives at the Australian War Memorial and would eventually take me to the Western Front.
Alec Ross was killed in the Great War, and his name is here, along with that of his brother, Goldie. Unlike so many young Australian soldiers, he didn't see it as some grand or noble adventure when he embarked for the Western Front. Right from the start, he saw it for what it was.
His graphic letters home somehow defied the censor, and even today, 100 years later, the words still resonate with soldiers from modern wars.
6 shells are bursting around here every minute, and you can't much sleep between them. Guns are belching out shells with the most thunderous clap each time. The ground is shaking with each explosion. I am wet, and the ground on which I rest is wet. My feet are cold. In fact, I am all cold. I am covered with cold, clotted sweat, and sometimes my person is foul. I am hungry. I am annoyed by the absurdity of war. And I see no chance of anything better for tomorrow, or the day after, or the year after.
Could think so few things could weigh so much, is all I can say.
Renee White is Alec Ross' great niece. Although she is aware of the significance of Alec's letters, she is yet to see them on exhibition at the memorial.
I feel incredibly calm because I'm normally a very panicky person. Because it's not about me, it's about these lost brothers of my grandfather, and I really hope in some way are here today.
Good morning, Renee.
Very nice to meet you.
Craig Tibbetts. So
Lovely
pleased to meet you.
Yeah, so grateful
wonderful.
to you.
Thank you very much for coming out and welcome to the War Memorial.
Curator Craig Tibbetts has organised a private viewing of the letters for Renee.
So it's been a while since your last visit then?
Yeah.
After you. Straight on ahead there. Yep. So this is the temporary First World War exhibition. So we basically, through this exhibition, it runs pretty much chronologically, starting with the outbreak of war and enlistment in 1914, some of those early engagements. So here we are at the first Western Front cabinet, and here, that's the bound set of letters of Goldie and Alec Ross.
Oh, fantastic.
So that's been in the collection for nearly 90 years now. All right, I think we're ready to open the glass case. These are really the photostat negatives that the memorial made from the typed copies that their father, the Reverend Ross, supplied to us in 1927.
This is extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, they're family letters, but they are from a journalist, aren't they?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
Renee has one more letter to share that is not part of the memorial's collection. This letter has nothing to do with the horrors of war. Deeply personal, its words are from a young man lamenting what could have been and what he knows will never be.
Dear Les, thank you for your letter. Re my heart. It is difficult to speak of those things, you know, owing to one's standards of gallantry. But I have never proposed matrimony to a blessed soul in this world, and I have, despite no small efforts, never attained to the grand passions since youth. and never been in love for more than a fortnight.
This is a matter for sincere regret.
For deep personal shame, I know, but God knows. I've done my best. I seem to be incapable of sustaining passion, though. It really just tore the heart out of me when I read that this is the way this man leaves the country here, feeling as if he won't achieve the personal level that perhaps he was brought up with. He was brought up in a very loving family.
What I get from it, apart from anything else, is each one of them was really something else. They were just young men with careers and interests and hopes and dreams, and you get a glimpse there of just one man's interrupted life. There's no doubting that Alec in particular, his voice is so loud. You know, his voice is still clear.
Every evening, the memorial holds a last post ceremony, and tonight it will honour the sacrifice of Lieutenant Alec Rose.
We remember and pay tribute to Second Lieutenant John Alexander Rose. Alec arrived in France in mid-1916 to join the 23rd Battalion in action at Posiers. However, he was too late to find his brother, who had gone missing 3 days beforehand during an attack near Mouquet Farm. On the 23rd of August 1916, Rose was heading to the front line when he was struck by the explosion of a nearby shell blast. One of his friends serving in the 23rd Battalion said that he preserved his quiet, philosophic disposition and his turn of quaint, sardonic humour to the last. Alec Rose was 32 years old.
It was nearly 100 years ago when Alec Rose put his thoughts on paper and wrote from the front line. Back then, he had no way of knowing that his words would be read by a Prime Minister who was determined that the sacrifice of all those men who fought on the Western Front is never forgotten.
My battalion has been at it for 8 days, and 1/3 of it is left, all shattered at that. And they're sticking it still, incomparable heroes all. We're lousy, stinking, ragged, unshaven and sleepless. Even when we're back a bit, we can't sleep for our own guns. I've one putty, a dead man's helmet, another dead man's gas protector, a dead man's bayonet. My tunic is rotten with other men's blood and partly splattered with a comrade's brains. It's horrible, but why should you people at home not know? Several of my friends are raving mad. I met 3 officers out in no man's land the other night, all rambling and mad, poor devils.